From the majestic peaks of the world's highest mountains to the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean, there lies an immense plain adorned with fields of wheat, corn, and cotton. Welcome to China, specifically Henan province, located south of the Yellow River. Within this province, we find the prefecture of Shangqiu, which is home to approximately 8 million inhabitants today. Its capital, situated at a crossroads and also named Shangqiu, holds great historical significance as it served as the inaugural capital of the Shang dynasty in 1600 BC. Enclosed within a 16th century wall and a protective moat, its historical quarter stands as one of China's 100 best-preserved historic centers. Nestled within these fortified walls lies the Centenary Catholic Mission. Since 1924, Shangqiu has been closely tied to the history and present of the Augustinian Recollects family. This mission represents the culmination of a dream that was nurtured over 3 centuries. The Augustinian Recollects, who had been present in the Philippines since 1606, always held Japan and China as desired mission fields. However, their Japanese endeavor lasted a mere 9 years due to relentless persecution by the ruling authorities. Between 1623 and 1632, the path was marked by a trail of martyrs, including both religious and lay individuals, Spanish and Japanese. After the execution of all the missionaries, the Recollects were never able to return. The Chinese mission, on the other hand, took longer to materialize but has endured until today. In February 1924, the Augustinian Recollect Javier Ochoa arrived in Shangqiu in advance, paving the way for the rest of the missionaries. He vividly describes the place as follows.
Everything here is flat. The inhabitants find it hard to imagine even the slightest elevation of the terrain. There are few parts in all of China that are as well connected. It only takes 26 hours by train to reach Shanghai. Agriculture is the primary source of income, and every inch of land is cultivated. Even the smallest plot is tilled to provide sustenance for the large population.
The mission entrusted to the Augustinian Recollects covers an area of 8,000 square kilometers, which is similar in size to the community of Madrid in Spain or 5 times the size of Mexico City. Out of its 2.5 million inhabitants, only 700 were Christians. However, in just 15 years, the missionaries multiplied this number by 12. The climate in Shangqiu is continental, with harsh winters averaging 5 degrees below zero in January. Summers, on the other hand, can be unbearable, with scorching heat. Javier Ochoa remarks,
There are days when the thermometer rises to 43 degrees in the shade. Typically, it reaches 39 or 40 degrees. With this heat, it is impossible to stay indoors.
Over the next 3 decades, 26 Spanish Recollects were sent to Shangqiu, along with 5 Spanish nuns and 3 Philippine nuns. Their first challenge was to understand the language, customs, and codes of conduct through a difficult process of enculturation. Establishing the mission also involved significant physical construction. In a little over 10 years, the missionaries scattered the territory with temples, residences, schools, a seminary, a catechetical training center, a medical clinic, and a home for abandoned girls. This last project, known as Holy Childhood, saved the lives of dozens of girls and provided them with a dignified future. It was one of the first social transformations undertaken by the missionaries. Javier Ochoa explains why.
It is terrifying and disheartening to see that when girls are born, they are abandoned on the streets or discarded in more remote places, where they become prey for crows, dogs, or wild animals.
At Holy Childhood, girls abandoned by their families were taught literacy, received comprehensive education, and acquired the tools to live with dignity. Many became agents of social change and, not a few, evangelizers among their fellow countrymen upon joining the new Congregation of Catechists of Christ the King, which was founded by the missionaries. The boys faced similar challenges. For many, their only means of survival was through theft or, even worse, joining violent gangs that fiercely competed for territorial control. Another missionary, Luis Lorente, described it this way.
Those who have 8 or 10 children, or even just 5 or 6, need not worry about anything except demanding a daily account of their stolen goods.
Healthcare was another impactful field of action in the mission. The Augustinian Recollect Pedro Colomo was a doctor who, with the help of the Catechists of Christ the King, established a free medical clinic for those who lacked resources. He prescribed antimalarial drugs and painkillers. Additionally, he designed and implemented mass vaccination campaigns 20 years before such plans became common, preventing hundreds of deaths during recurring cholera epidemics and other infectious diseases. The dire situation in which the population of Shangqiu lived can be attributed to the chaotic state of China during the first half of the 20th century. It was marked by a prolonged civil war in stages after the fall of the last emperor, a war against Japan, the brutal occupation by Japanese troops, World War II, and the rise of the Maoist regime. The mission was bombed and occupied by troops of different factions, and the religious suffered kidnappings, imprisonments, evacuations, and various forms of pressure. An international economic blockade was imposed, communication with the outside world was cut off, and essential resources were frequently lacking. However, this suffocating situation did not hinder the growth of the Church. The efforts, work, and especially the witness of life, hospitality, kindness, generosity, and dedication of the missionaries attracted many new Christians. This resulted in sustained growth, which eventually shaped a strong and steadfast local church. That small mission of foreign religious became a diocese with all its structures, a seminary, male and female religious life, catechists, and social works. The number of Christians approached 10,000. Chinese vocations included 17 Augustinian Recollects and 22 catechists of Christ the King. Only the lack of resources prevented even greater numbers. The Recollect priest Lucas Wang described it in this way.
At that time, there was a shortage of many things to eat, to live, and the missionaries would kneel down to ask the Lord to remedy that need. And immediately, people would appear bringing rice, food, and everything so that neither the friars nor the nuns would lack anything.
Several examples corroborate how those missionary communities of religious men and women were composed of committed, good-hearted individuals with unwavering faith. This character proved providential for the success of the mission. Mariano Gaspio arrived in China at a young age, and it was his first assignment. His tireless apostolate, intense prayer, and efforts in connecting with people made him especially beloved. He was the missionary who mastered Mandarin the best. He served as a catechist instructor and coordinated his fellow Recollect brothers during particularly tense moments. After his expulsion from China, he became a trainer for future missionaries and a spiritual guide for generations of religious. He is currently in the process of being declared a saint. Esperanza Ierb, a cloistered nun, answered the call of Bishop Javier Ochoa to educate the girls of the Holy Childhood and to promote female religious life in Shangqiu. As a co-founder of the Augustinian Recollect Missionary Sisters, she dedicated herself wholeheartedly to the Chinese people and embodied a contemplative and missionary vocation within the Augustinian Recollect charism. She is also in the process of canonization. Venancio Martinez left a reputation for holiness. He was an exceptionally kind and joyful man. He served as a professor in the seminary and promoted lay apostolate, but his most committed role was attending to the excluded and providing refuge and security to people amidst criminal gangs and invading troops. He prevented many tragedies. 1 year after offering himself as a victim to the merciful love, he died in the mission in 1944, suffering from intense fevers. Javier Ochoa, the first Recollect to set foot in Shangqiu, also served as its first prelate and bishop from January 1929 to December 1947. After a vacancy of nearly 2 years, Arturo Quintanilla became the next bishop. However, disagreements with the authorities marked the beginning of the end for him. In 1949, the Maoist regime took control.
和国中央人民政府今天胜利了。
And the missionaries became targets as enemies of the new regime. Several of them, including Luis Aguirre, experienced imprisonment. Aguirre shared his harrowing experience during Holy Week of 1951.
They prohibited me from leaving the mission without their permission. So, I was locked up for a year. They demanded that I provide information about everyone who visited the mission. They imprisoned me without explaining why. I stayed in jail for almost a month, and it was terrible. Every day, they took people out to be executed, about 5 or 6 every day. The prisoners were aware of this, and so was I. Initially, we were not allowed to do anything, but later they granted permission to use the toilet. We had to ask for permission even to scratch ourselves or turn around. I was thrown into jail on Palm Sunday night. So, Holy Week was significant for me. The passion of the Lord helped me endure that Holy Week with resignation and even joy. Yes, with joy. I suffered a lot in jail. When I was released, I weighed only 35 kilograms.
The last 2 Spanish Recollects were expelled from China on August 30, 1952. The confusion was overwhelming. Professed seminarians were taken out of the mission and sent first to Hong Kong and then to Spain. The remaining seminarians returned to their homes. The catechists of Christ the King were forced to return to their families and were released from their vows. Chinese Recollect priests faced monitoring, arrests, interrogations, and were sent to political re-education camps or forced labor camps. 5 of the Chinese religious and 1 seminarian died under terrible circumstances, and the Augustinian Recollect family considers them true martyrs who suffered greatly for their faith and love for the Augustinian Recollect way of life. The government's pressure on the remaining diocese of Shangqiu persisted relentlessly to varying degrees. The toughest years were between 1966 and 1976 during the Cultural Revolution, which aimed to eliminate all traces of non-communist influence in China. Nicolás, an Augustinian Recollect, described those years as follows.
It was like a violent typhoon that devastated the entire structure of the church, halting all religious activities.
However, prison, surveillance, and public scorn did not achieve their goal. Catholics defied restrictions, walking even long distances to attend Mass in private homes. Priests found hidden ways to evangelize, administer sacraments, and visit the faithful. Families gathered to pray, and every Christian became a missionary. This underground church witnessed between 6,000 and 7,000 new conversions. The death of Mao in 1979 and the rise to power of Deng Xiaoping, one of his political adversaries, brought some relaxation and allowed the church to regain certain social space and public activity. The Chinese Augustinian Recollects who made it to this point embarked on an incredible and commendable task, unparalleled in any other Recollect mission. Marcos was deported to a distant commune. After 35 years of separation from his loved ones, he managed to return to Shangqiu in 1985 but passed away the following year. Lucas Wang was imprisoned and could only exercise his priesthood between 1957 and 1966. During the Cultural Revolution, he endured slander, humiliation, interrogations, and surveillance. He even had to undergo a forced marriage with a former catechist of Christ the King. His internal sufferings were unimaginable. When he resolved the situation, he returned to work as a priest and finally enjoyed community life until his death. Jose Li was a seminarian when Shangqiu was closed. He managed to fulfill his priestly vocation and was ordained in 1957. This led to his imprisonment and exile until 1993. After serving his sentence, he returned to Shangqiu to pursue his second vocation. He professed as an Augustinian Recollect. He passed away 8 years later, leaving a reputation for holiness among the Christians. Jose Wang was a tireless evangelizer. He spent over 20 years in prison after being sentenced in different trials in 1951, 1955, and 1968. When released, he visited and served Christians, taught catechumens, all while using a bicycle. Due to his frail and humble appearance, he went unnoticed by the authorities, allowing him to travel countless kilometers to spread the gospel. He managed to restore ecclesial and religious life in He's, a neighboring diocese to Shangqiu, where he was appointed bishop in 1996. He rebuilt the cathedral, which he consecrated himself in the presence of 20,000 faithful in 2001. He also revitalized religious life and the clergy to the best of his ability. Nicolás is the most emblematic figure in this story. His life testimony perfectly encapsulates the results of the selfless work of the Recollect missionaries in China. He entered the Shangqiu seminary at the age of 12 and was ordained a priest in 1948. Endowed with extraordinary intelligence, he managed to survive the revolutionary upheaval by working in the ophthalmology department of the local hospital. In 1957, he attempted to restore worship in one of the temples of Shangqiu and was sentenced to 3 years of forced labor in a brick factory. After completing that sentence and spending 2 more years working in the hospital, he tried to reopen worship in 1962 and was sentenced to 2 years of confinement. Following that second sentence, he dedicated 12 years to caring for his elderly and sick mother, despite living in extreme poverty. In 1979, he received a rehabilitation letter from the government and was assigned as a high school English teacher. In his free time, he secretly continued his priestly ministry. Using his position as a foreign language teacher, he made a remarkably intelligent move that would change everything. In 1980, he wrote a letter to the Augustinian Recollects in Manila, recalling their address from memory, like a castaway putting a message in a bottle and tossing it into the sea. The letter spoke poetically about landscapes and nature, avoiding any details that might arouse suspicion from the guards of the revolution. His position as a foreign language teacher provided a good alibi for sending such a letter without raising suspicion. The Augustinian Recollects understood the hidden message in the letter and discovered that there was still religious in China and that the former mission was still active. Nicolás was deeply moved to receive a response. The order remembered them, prayed for them, and had not lost hope of reconnecting with them. The correspondence began, filled with double meanings, non-obvious information, and expressions of affection. The Chinese seminarians who had been sent to Spain were now settled friars in communities in Taiwan and the Philippines. As borders opened, they began visiting their hometowns to reunite with their families and the religious in Shangqiu. The first direct contact with Nicolás, after 30 years of isolation, occurred in 1981.
I arrived in Beijing at 10 o'clock at night, and it was quite cold. I didn't know where to go, so I kissed the ground. It was the first time I touched Chinese soil after being away for over 20 years. Then I went to our mission, but since I didn't know the address of Father Nicolás or my family, I stayed in a dirty hostel. The next day, I told myself that I had to find my home, my family. Don't you know that I am your brother? He became incredibly emotional. I asked him to find out the whereabouts of the missionary fathers. He knew everything, all the details about the church, he knew everything perfectly well. So, Nicolás Schur and Jose Lee traveled from their respective villages to see me. We spent the whole night talking, chatting, and weeping. Nicolás believed that the Order of Augustinian Recollects no longer existed. The first time he saw me, he thought he was seeing visions, that it was a dream and not real.
I obtained permission and flew directly from Manila to Beijing. The communists accompanied me and provided a free car. They took me to my sister's village, where my family was. When my sister heard that I was there, she was in the wheat field, in the threshing floor. She couldn't get up. She was overwhelmed with emotion. Almost everything was the same. The seminary still existed, Monsignor Nicolás Schur was living there, and the church remained almost unchanged.
I entered the seminary in 1940. In 1943, even though we didn't have vacations, that year was special because since we didn't have enough food in the seminary, they sent us home for the summer. And it was the last time I saw my family. In 1990, while I was living in the United States, I managed to take a vacation to China. It was the first time since 1943 that I saw my family. Surprisingly, the house where I had lived still existed in 1990. I'm not sure about its current state. It was an old shack. I saw many nephews and second cousins, at least 60 people. They were my family, as we were 7 siblings. Nicolás Schur was overjoyed because for so many years, he knew nothing about the order, and we knew nothing about him.
Lucas Wang explains how, from the perspective of the religious in Shangqiu, those first encounters with the Recoletos who visited them from abroad were.
I can't recall the exact timing, but it was in the 1980s when Recollects from outside China came to visit us. For 10 years, I would be interrogated by the police about the foreigners, their activities, and the questions they asked. I would simply say that they came to check on our well-being. During those 10 years, I would leave home at 6 in the evening and not return until 9 or 10 at night, after the interrogations. How I suffered during those 10 years.
Nicolás retired as a teacher in 1987 and dedicated himself solely to apostolic work. As an interlocutor with the authorities, he attempted and succeeded in reclaiming church properties. He had in mind and in his heart the rebirth of the mission. With wise patience, unwavering trust in God, and the ability to overcome hardships and bitterness, and with his welcoming and consistent character, Nicolás won over many to the faith, revived male and female religious life, nurtured the diocese with new clergy, and gained the respect of the authorities. The mission experienced a second spring, and Nicolás restored community life, which he never abandoned until his passing. In 1991, after 39 years without a shepherd, he was consecrated as bishop of the diocese and received attributions as prior with special concessions and novice master of the Order of Augustinian Recollects. As a young man, he understood the immense value that the presence of female religious life brought to the local church. Therefore, he did not hesitate to reintroduce it with slow but firm steps. Teresa Wang was one of the pioneers in this revival.
16岁那时候一开始主要在上牛市那个拜堂，在那个堂就那时候去上那课。
When I was 16 years old, I arrived in the village where Nicolás was the parish priest. Every Saturday, after breakfast, I would ride my bicycle to the parish to attend catechism, and we would stay until all the faithful left after Sunday Mass. Then Nicolás would always talk to us about the advantages of becoming nuns and guide us on how to pursue it. At that time, I only knew that being a nun meant not getting married. But he also explained the challenges of being a nun, and despite the difficulties, I continued striving to become one. The bishop was hesitant to accept us, because he had no one to teach us.
Nicolás deserves a place of honor in the history of the Augustinian Recollects and the Catholic Church in China. He embodies the legacy left by the first missionaries with wisdom and dedication, the martyrdom spirit in the face of relentless persecution, the gospel mandate of loving one's enemies, and an unwavering trust in God above all challenges, trials, or bitterness.
I have never lost hope because before opening this church, I chose the Sacred Heart as its patron. Because he said he would always be with us. I know that this church will not disappear.
For years before his death, while lying in a hospital bed and speaking in Spanish that he had learned as a child in the seminary but not practiced for 50 years, he said,
And thank you also to the fathers, brothers, and sisters of my family of St. Augustine.
Nicolás was a master of two virtues that the Catholic Church in China greatly needs: discretion and prudence. He knew when to speak and when to remain silent. He never compromised his conscience or principles. Accustomed to pressure and injustice, he maintained an extremely polite and respectful demeanor towards everyone. Nicolás was a magnet for vocations. Today, around 20 Chinese Augustinian Recollects and approximately 25 Augustinian Recollect missionary sisters of Chinese origin owe their vocations to his inspiring example and his call to a coherent and joyful life. It is touching to know that for decades, the authorities tried to convince Nicolás that the Augustinian Recollects had vanished, claiming that he and all the Chinese had been abandoned by them. However, he did not succumb to the propaganda, and his letter brought about a complete change of course for the mission and the Augustinian Recollects. Religious life continues to be unofficially recognized in China. Relations between the government and the church are not without challenges and complexities. Technological and social advancements have not prevented extensive control and ideological pressures. New challenges such as consumerism, materialism, and individualism have notably influenced the younger generations in China. Internal challenges also exist, including uncertainties in the succession processes of bishops, difficulties in the initial and ongoing formation of religious, maintaining a balance between communal life and pastoral service, and managing economic resources. The Shangqiu mission celebrates its 100th anniversary. Since setting foot on Chinese soil, the members of the Augustinian Recollect family have been sowers of hope. And there is no shortage of reasons for hope. A virtue so important when difficulties intensify and the future needs to be illuminated with the firmness of faith and trust in the community of brothers.